This is the first of 4 webinars on risk management presented by Forrest & Company. My name is Jason Legere. I'll be moderating today's session. A couple of logistical points. We are recording this session, and a recording will be provided to you at a later date. We've set aside time for questions at the end of the session. So please use the Q&A feature in Zoom to type your questions, and I'll read them off to Mark at the end of the session. Please note that you can also ask your questions anonymously if you wish to do that. We'll also be conducting a couple of polls. They will also be anonymous. And if you have any non-technical questions or anything to share outside of the course material, please feel free to send me a chat if you have any other questions. So your presenter today, I'm very happy to introduce Mark Tassé. Mark is Vice President of Risk at Forrest & Company and is an internationally recognized and sought after expert on anti-bribery, corruption, and ethics. He teaches this topic at 2 prominent Canadian universities and has presented to parliamentary committees on areas around money laundering and the proceeds of crime, in addition to maintaining an extensive client list. So Mark, welcome. We look forward to your comments, and I will hand it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Jason. I really appreciate your introduction. So now I'm going to have to live up to what you said. So I'll do my best to try to make it interesting. So as you pointed out, today is the first of a series of 4 webinars on risk in the area of global pandemic. So today we'll be talking about risk management, the guideline related to that. And next week, we'll be talking about the compliance management system. The week after, anti-bribery management system. And on July the 28th, the whistleblowing management system. This is something very important because we hear very often on the news that whistleblowers are not protected. One thing I'd like to point out is that each topic that I will be covering today and in the next 3 weeks are subject to international standards. So there is an international standard for each of those. So this is great. So whatever I'll be talking today, you can always validate it. You can go back to the ISO standard if you want to get more details. If it's a brief discussion that we're having, and my goal is to interact with you as much as possible. So it's not going to be a full lecture. I'm going to try to just give you an overview of the topic. But if you ever need to refer to something more in detail, then you can actually go and have a look at it. So can you switch the page, Jason, please? Perfect. So, but maybe to start off with, we would like to do a little poll before we go any further. So, does your organization allocate fund and or people resources to addressing and mitigating risk? So there'll be a short poll right now that Jason will probably start in a few seconds. Feel free to participate if you're comfortable with it. If it doesn't start right now, there's no problem there. We can do it later on during
everyone, people are answering now, Mark.
Oh, okay, perfect. Thank you.
So I will just share the results of that if it's not showing up on your screen. The answer yes to the extent needed was the leader, with 60% of respondents saying that the organization does allocate funds and people to the extent needed. 10% have said yes, but we should likely allocate more. And 30% said no, and we have no plans to do so.
Okay, well, I think that with the pandemic that we're in right now, probably some people will reconsider reviewing their risk assessment program and also maybe investing if they don't have one already, because as I will try to explain to you today, when we're talking about risk, there's a lot of risk, and too often we only focus on the financial one and the legal one, but I'll be discussing about other type of risk that we're facing. Can you skip to the next one, please, Jason? Perfect. So first of all, how do we define risk? So if we look at a very theoretical way of defining risk, we say that's the effect of uncertainty on objectives. But we have to keep in mind that risk can never be eliminated, but instead requires management, mitigation, and a benchmark risk tolerance based on the likelihood of an event and its perceived severity. And if you were to talk to people that actually are doing risk management, they will always talk to you about the matrix that they're using. And the matrix basically, on one side, you have the likelihood of happening, and then you have the severity. But we have to be very careful because, for example, if we were to, let's say, for example, we were December 31st, 2019, and we were looking at the COVID-19, for a lot of companies, the likelihood of happening was pretty low, but the severity was really high. But the thing is, because of the fact that the likelihood of happening was quite low, they would not have put all their energy and review their risk program they have in place because of it. So that's one thing we have to keep in mind. Too often, we're good at managing risks that we know, risks that we have experience dealing with. But when it comes to risks that we're not used to, or the one that we're not sure that we got all the information to fully understand the effect of it, that's usually where we have big issues. As I was pointing out before, maybe just to say, I'm only going to say it once, but when we're talking about risk management, we're referring to the ISO standard 31000. So if you're familiar with ISO standard, so the risk is actually covered by the ISO standard 31000. Basically, the ISO standard regroup the set of best practice. It doesn't mean that's the absolute answer to everything, but at least it gives you the best practice in order to be able to put down a framework and work from it. Okay, so now if we look at the different type of risks that are available, well, not available, I should say, but that we're actually exposed to. So the first one, the legal risk. That's the risk of being in trouble because we're not complying with a regulation. What I would like to point out on this one, the legal risk, if you're talking to lawyers, they will always tell you there is the letter of the law and there is the spirit of the law. The legal risk is that you're not respecting the letter of the law. When it comes to the spirit of the law, this is something that sometimes we tend to forget, but we have to be very careful with it because our reputation is at stake if it point out that we're not respecting the spirit of the law, we're only respecting the letter of the law. I'll give you an example. You remember the Panama Papers? There was like a big bad publicity that came out of that, and the companies that were named in the Panama Paper leaks suffered reputational risk issues. The thing was the fact that to actually invest your money in a tax haven country, well, basically, there's nothing illegal with that. Because if you were to be talking to a tax specialist, you would tell you there is tax evasion. This is something you never want to do. There is tax planning, which is something you want to do. But in between, there is tax avoidance. And tax avoidance is to actually use different vehicle from tax haven countries and stuff like that. But basically, what you're doing is in accordance with the taxation laws. So you're respecting the letter of the law, but you're not respecting the spirit of the law, which is to avoid doing tax evasion. And this is why now Canada Revenue Agency has introduced a new concept, which they call aggressive tax avoidance. And aggressive tax avoidance is almost the same thing as tax evasion. The reason why I'm telling you that, because when we're considering the legal risk, sometimes there's something that we forget to take into consideration. And I would say it's the people that deals with the legal risk. Very often I call them the CLO. And I know for some of you, you may think it's the chief legal officer. No, to me, it's not the chief legal officer. CLO stand for the chief loophole officer. The person who's always finding a loophole, the person that will make you respect the letter of the law, but you will always get away with it with the spirit of the law because the person found a loophole. And this is dangerous more and more when we're talking about reputational risk or competitive risk. The fact that you're not respecting the letter of the law can actually jeopardize your company and the reputation of your company. So please try to avoid as much as possible the chief loophole officers, the people that will find a loophole. this is non-ethical, and this is something that you might not want to. So when you're doing your risk assessment, please do not rely on someone who will tell you, I found a loophole, we're good with it. No, you found a loophole, that's one thing. We're not good with it because the loophole will probably change over time. They will amend the law or something like that, and then we're going to be exposed to a risk that we don't know how to manage. Other type of risk, the operational risk, well, the risk that we might not basically be able to continue our operation. Very often the operational risk is quite closely related to the finance risk. So if we're having financial issues, we don't have enough money, so we might be going out of business. And I would say that right now, a lot of companies and organizations after COVID-19 are really looking at the operational risk to say, are we able to continue operating? And if we change our way of operation, are we going to be viable? So that's another type of risk that you need to consider when you're looking at your corporate risk management system. The fiduciary risk. The fiduciary risk is an important risk because basically you have to realize that if you are a director of a corporation, you have a fiduciary risk. You need to technically protect the value of the company for the shareholders. And that would separate in different forms. So you have a duty to prevent, a duty to detect, a duty to inform, and then a duty to correct. And if, as a director, you did not do that, so you did not perform, you were negligent in doing so, then you're going to be exposed to personal risks. So basically, people could sue you, or if you're making a claim on something that happened, the insurance company might not cover you because they would say you did not show due diligence. You were negligent in your role as a director, a board director. Reputational risk. Well, reputational risk, this is something that we hear more and more in the last 10 years, I would say, and it's mostly because of the social media. As soon as a bad information, or I shouldn't say bad information, as soon as there is allegation of wrongdoing against the company, it doesn't take long that it hits the social media. And I know sometimes you're talking with lawyers, it tells you, well, don't worry, the case will last for about 5 or 10 years, and then we'll be able to settle out of court. Well, I agree that the legal system might be pretty slow, but one thing that is really, really quick, it's the social media trial. Within about 48 hours, they will decide if you're guilty or not, and they will actually impose you a sentence. So just be careful when it comes to reputation. And the last 6 months, we had situation, and especially before Christmas, we had two back-to-back. The first one that we had was with McDonald. I don't know if you remember, the CEO of McDonald resigned from his position. And why did he resign? Because he was in a consensual relationship with an employee of McDonald. And what did happen? Well, he went to do some Christmas shopping. I think it was beginning of November or mid-November. He went to do some Christmas shopping, and he was holding hands with that person. And an employee happened to be there, so took a picture of that and uploaded that to on the social media, saying it's pretty weird at McDonald's. There is double standard. So there is standard and regulation that says we're not supposed to be into a even consensual relationship with someone that actually we exercise power over. But on the other hand, we have the CEO who is in a relationship with someone. And the board of directors of McDonald's actually had to take a decision, and the CEO had to resign because otherwise it would have affected their reputation. That was their way of perceiving a reputational risk. And a few weeks later, we had the same issue with Walmart, but not on the same level, but we had a reputational issue. I don't know if you remember, Walmart made the news for what they call the ugly Christmas sweaters. What they did, they gave a contract to a supplier to produce 4 different Christmas ugly sweater, and it's supposed to be fun. And but the thing was that, and if you want to, you can Google it after the webinar. But go online and go Walmart ugly Christmas sweater, and you'll see the issue was that it was a snowman that was sitting behind a table, and on that table there was a mountain of snow and 3 different lines of snow. And at the bottom it said, "Let it snow." Well, basically, we all know that sometimes snow can also relate to cocaine. So it was almost like if the snowman was going to do a line of cocaine. So this is not the message that Walmart wanted to send to the people to say, hey, we think this is funny to have a snowman standing behind a table with 3 lines of cocaine. That was not at all what they wanted to. And there was artificial intelligence that was involved because basically when the supplier wanted to upload their stuff to be selling online for Walmart, it has to go through artificial intelligence. And there is different controls that are in place to make sure there's nothing offensive. But what happened at that time was the fact it was Christmas, Let It Snow, that's the name of a Christmas song, and there was actually a snowman. So for them, the artificial intelligence didn't pick it up that the snow could be related to cocaine. So that was an issue, and the board of directors had to react very quickly. They had to apologize for people who got offended, to say that this is not what we support, and we're really sorry about the situation, and we had already took corrective actions, and we'll also took action for that to prevent that from happening again in the future. So that's another example of reputational risk that is really important when you're doing your risk management. You have the competitive risk. You want to be seen as a fair competitor. If you're always winning all the contracts, and people might actually start raising concern to say, how come this person is always winning? How come it's always the same one? It's almost like if we're no competition. Well, there was allegation of corruption for a very long period of time on some Canadian companies and international companies. And they had to live with the fact that they were involved in bribery and corruption. And this is not something that we can close our eyes and say, hey, well, bribery and corruption doesn't exist. If you're in the risk management sector, you will probably, or you are probably aware of something that is produced on a yearly basis by Transparency International. And we call that the Corruption Perception Index. So for each country, they list the perception of corruption that there would be, and it tells you what the risk is. In Canada, usually we're about in the top 10 of being less corrupted. But hey, if you look at the World Bank department, well, SNC-Lavalin was all over. So we cannot say that we're better in Canada than everywhere around the world. SNC-Lavalin did actually took a pretty big hit, and Canada also took a pretty big hit. And at that time, SNC-Lavalin was winning all the contracts, and he was performing them as was the specification and everything. But the thing was the fact that they actually breached some competitive laws and also breached laws that prevent companies from giving bribes or collecting bribes from people. Then you also have the security risk. And when I'm talking about security risk, I'm not only talking about the risk related to the physical security and safety, I'm also talking about personal data. So companies need to protect the information that they have from their client, from their supplier, from everyone. So all the personal, from their employees also. So all the information that you gather, you need to protect that information. We just need to think of last year, there was Desjardins, that's a financial institution that was hit by a breach of information that was actually done by internally by an employee. We had the same thing with LiveSmart or whatsoever. So we hear that very often, and you might wonder how come are there more data breach in the last few years? Is because before that there was no requirement to actually disclose it. So it's only since I think November 2018 that it became a requirement. So the security risk is a risk that you need to consider also. And finally, the ethical risk. Are the customers, are the stakeholders perceiving the people working for the company as being ethical? This is very important. So when we're talking about a risk management system, you need to consider all those risks. You need to assess them, and then you need to quantify them in terms of what you accept and what you're not accepting. And this is what we call your risk appetite. Now, if we switch to the next one, we can be more specific about risk in time of COVID-19. I was talking about risk appetite. Very often we say it's a risk culture, and this is a tolerance that we're comfortable with. Call it appetite or call it tolerance to accepting risk. I always I'm always very careful with that, because what you may decide or what you may consider to be an acceptable risk might, within a couple of clicks on the internet, become a risk that you don't know or you're not prepared how to manage. So as we pointed out before, it's called risk mitigation. You can never eliminate risk, but at least you can have a plan in place. If a risk happens, at least you know how to react to it. It could be in terms of communication. It could be in terms of setting up new and control in order to avoid those things from happening again. And what we need to realize is that with the COVID-19, this is a totally new reality. First of all, there is way more money flowing from the government, and there is less checks, internal control in place. We heard some government, we heard some companies saying we're in time of crisis and we are in a state of emergency, so all the red tape has been actually cut off. Well, what people call red tape, people in my field of expertise, we call that internal control. And we think that it's not the red tape, we think it has a very high value. So the added value is the fact that it protects the company. And if you're a board member or if you're a C-level suite executive, you are probably aware of that. You prefer to have internal control that are in place that some people might consider to be red tape, but at least are protecting the company and the stakeholders of the company. And also, as I pointed out before, as a board of director member, you need to actually show that you're doing correctly your fiduciary duty, and you cannot be negligent, because otherwise it will come and bite you off. We also have security and cyber threat. Right now, a lot of people are working from home. We don't hear any data breach or any type of ransomware, but according to me, there might be some. Companies are just too shy to disclose it. They don't want to stress out people. They don't want to actually expose what they're really up against, because right now they don't have any alternative solution. And that's the issue. We're all working remotely. We're dealing with sensitive information. For example, CRA, the employees are working remotely. The RCMP, they're working remotely also, but we all know that they're dealing with very sensitive information. I hope, and I'm quite sure, that it is well protected. But what if a hacker, a real good hacker, is able to have access to it? What plan do they have in place? How did they define the risk? What is the risk that they're willing to tolerate? Those are all questions that we need to always ask ourselves and to document. It's important to document your risk assessment. And also there will be, unfortunately, some companies that will be willing to bend the rules in order just to survive. Some companies will say ethics is a luxury that I cannot afford at this time. We're in survival mode. We do the best we can. And yes, maybe if you were to ask me about 6 months ago, if I was actually comfortable with dealing with this situation the same way that I'm dealing with it today, I would probably give you another answer. But this is who I am, this is what we are, and this is what we do. So those are examples of risk. And why is it important to make sure that we're doing the risk management program? It's because you need to protect the assets of the company, the reputation of the company, and you also need to keep in mind that there is a cost whenever there is a scandal. Think of SNC-Lavalin, and if you were to look at their stocks, the trading of their stocks, as soon as there was allegation of a wrongdoing, the company took a really big hit. But then on December the 18th, when they were actually found guilty of fraud, it was the opposite. The value of the companies went up, and you may wonder why. It was because people thought that the consequences would be higher. So in these days, allegation of wrongdoing are worse than a conviction, because the market reacts so quickly. People don't actually want to tolerate bad behaviors or lack of ethics. So therefore, they're selling the shares of the company, and that's dangerous. So the cost of a scandal or an exposure is not only the legal cost and the financial cost of the fine, it's the reputation that takes for. They usually say that in order to reestablish your reputation, it takes 80 weeks. Well, 80 weeks, that's a year and a half. That's a lot of time. And I'm not sure that some company can actually take a hit for 80 weeks. A year and a half is way too long. As I said, the fiduciary role, duty to prevent, detect, inform, and correct. And also the director's liability. As I pointed out, if you're not actually doing a risk assessment, if you're not actually managing the risk, you're just saying, well, you know what, we're going to deal with the situation when it happens. We have legal counsel and we have a very good team of lawyers that represent us. Well, this is not called risk management. This is called dealing with situations, and you need to prevent it. You need, because otherwise, if you're just still going to take care of it whenever it happens, then you would be in the correction part. You need to be preventing, detecting, and informing. And just remember, at the beginning of the survey, about 30% of you said no, the company doesn't actually invest in risk management, and we don't see why we should. Well, I would say that's probably why you should. And even if you already did invest, you should review it, because of COVID-19. You need to keep into consideration that it needs to be changed, because otherwise you're not going to be in the game anymore, and you may be exposed to risks that you're not prepared to manage, and you don't know how to react to it. So that being said, I think now that we're up to our next question on the poll. So Jason, I will let you handle that part.
Okay, so everybody should see the question now. Okay, so I will share the results of the poll. Question, does your organization have a risk management plan? 57% of the audience have said yes, and it is regularly tested and refreshed. And 43% have said no, there is not a structured plan.
Well, I think it's pretty representative. And well, first of all, congratulations for the 57% that said they already have one and they're regularly testing it or refreshing it. For the other one, well, you know what you need to talk on the next, put on the next item on the agenda of your board of directors meeting, because I think it is really important. And if we look at the next page on how to do, because if you're bringing that to top management and executive and you're telling them, okay, well, maybe we need to reconsider or review what we have in place, they're going to ask you, okay, how do we do it? And one thing that you have to keep in mind, this is where you actually talk with people that are specialists in the field, or you rely a little bit on the international standard. But one of the things is to keep in mind that the risk plan is only good as the gap that that will bring up in the light. So doing a gap analysis, looking at what are the best practice versus what we have in place. Uh, Companies do have something in place. Not many companies have nothing in place. It's not like a startup. So sometimes there is something in place, but you need to do a gap analysis. So your risk plan will be good as the gap you'll do, and also to see what you consider to be acceptable versus not acceptable. You also need to stay current and address the emerging threats. That is key. Don't look at what happened in the past all the time. Look at the emerging threats. This is what really is important, especially in the period that we're living right now. And keep in mind that the most effective risk plan will actually be in twin with the strategic goal of the business, are customized to the business that they protect. They take human factor into account. They're flexible, they're inclusive and well understood, and they're routinely tested and updated. And one thing is important, customized, because too often people will take a risk management program from another company and just adapt it. Well, be careful. That's a starting point, but it's not a boilerplate. You cannot just take it and say, okay, we have one in place. First of all, you need to adapt it, you need to test it, and then you need to make sure that your employees who will be affected by those risks are aware of what you have in place and what you intend to do and how you intend to mitigate the risk. So the sharing of the information is also very, very important. And finally, the what next? I would say The what next would be to assess your risk plan through the lens of your risk culture and tolerance. But please don't take it for granted. It's not because last year the risk tolerance and culture of the company was something that it's the same thing this year. I would say if you're talking to executive, or if you are an executive, or if you're a board member, or you interact with board members, please make sure to have them restate what is the risk culture of the company and what is the risk tolerance, especially after COVID-19. Be careful, it may have changed a lot, so you need to make sure you understand it. If the risk tolerance has increased, well, then have control in place in order to mitigate, or if not mitigate, at least to be prepared to be facing what will be coming up in terms of reputational risk, in terms of allegations. You need to be prepared. No company can say there is no risk at all, but companies should say, we actually are aware of the risk that we're facing. We are managing the risk up to a certain level of tolerance, and we're reviewing it on a frequent basis. So you need to audit it, but please modify as appropriate. It's not because you're modifying your risk management plan that it means that the one you already had in place wasn't good. It just means that you need to upgrade it on a yearly basis. Honestly, I believe on a yearly basis. Have a look at your plan. Say, you know what, that's our plan. That's our risk tolerance. That's our risk culture. Are we still comfortable considering the emerging threats? Are we prepared? Do we want to review it? Please do so. That's my best advice that I can give you. So now I'm going to stop right there. So if we have a couple of questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them.
Yeah, we've had a few questions come along. One's actually been asked a couple of times here is, how do organizations articulate risk appetite?
Okay, usually this is discussed at board meetings. They actually define to say, okay, well, this is what we need to protect. This is what our shareholders ask us to actually protect them against. And you need to consider all the stakeholders, not only the shareholders, but all the stakeholders involved. And then say, if that was to happen, what would be the consequences and how are we equipped to deal with it? So this is how they usually do it.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned the idea of a stress test on a plan.
Yes.
What does a stress test look like within an organization?
Okay, within an organization, the stress test is to take some of the activities and then have a look, review them, audit them, and then compare them with what actually was supposed to happen versus what did happen. So, for example, if we have identified that we were willing to tolerate a certain type of risk, and it comes out that when they did the contract, they actually had a higher risk than what was supposed to be tolerated, but it still went ahead with it. How come? That's the question you need to ask yourself. Why? Sometimes the stress test is they would say, well, we don't want to do business in that type of industry, or we don't want to be dealing with those third parties, because very often your risk comes from third party. It's not always from your employees. It's the people that you're dealing with. I'll give you an example of that. Joe Fresh. I think you all remember what happened in Bangladesh maybe 10 years ago, or maybe less than that, but almost 10 years ago. Joe Fresh was actually having a production that was made in Bangladesh, and in the warehouse where that was actually produced, or the production room that happened, it totally collapsed, and a lot of people died. And Loblaws thought that, hey, you know what? We're not responsible for it. This was done by a third party. There was an external supplier, and it was not true. It came to bite them back by saying, no, you had a responsibility. You ought to know. You should have questioned yourself about it. And another example of stress test, I would say Costco. If you want to be selling some of your product at Costco right now, they're asking you, where are you manufacturing them or producing them? And if you say outside of Canada, then one of the things that they will do, and it will be at your own cost, they will send an independent auditor that will go have a look at the manufacturing process and to see if it does respect safety, human rights, and all of those different type of specific guidelines and regulations. And then they will come back and tell you the result, the stress test of what happened. And then we'll say, okay, if you're able to do business with them or not. So part of their stress test at Costco is to really investigate deeper in their third party, because they think that the third parties are for them one of the risks that it's hard to be managing and mitigating.
Thank you. What are some of the human factors you need to consider when developing or reviewing your risk plan?
Okay, one of the biggest human factor that you have to keep in mind is that when we were born, we were all a social type of people, which means we're not social. It's the people around us that tell us what is right versus what is wrong. Keep in mind when you see kids, let's say they're 2, 3 years old, they're playing in the sandbox and they're having fun, and another kids comes around. The first thing the other kid will do is try to grab the toy from the one who's already there. And what will be the reaction of the one who actually was already there playing with his toy? He would either push the other kid or hit the kid with the toy. That's just called asocial type of behavior. We're not social. It's the people around us. It's your mom, it's your dad that tells you, no, you need to share your toys. You don't hit people. And so behavior is actually influenced by, first of all, our asocial type. And also, what you have to keep in mind is that whenever we do something wrong or we have to make an ethical decision, let's say we did it right, there was three elements that are involved. First of all, there need to be an opportunity. Secondly, there need to be a motivation, and I'm talking about doing something wrong. So opportunity, motivation, and the last one, the rationalization. How would you rationalize doing something that is risky, something that is not acceptable? And in time of COVID-19, some people are able to rationalize almost everything right now. They can say it's to save jobs. Uh, and whenever you talk to people who committed fraud or had some non-ethical behavior, their main motivation was not always to get more money. It was not greed. It was performance anxiety. They were afraid they would lose their job if they wouldn't do it. They were afraid that the boss would not consider them for a promotion. So the anxiety, and whenever we're dealing with risk management and we're dealing with people behavior, we always take into consideration what is the anxiety that we're exposing those people to, and we try to manage it. So the managing of anxiety is something that we need to keep in mind also.
Okay, thank you. And we've got time for one more question. And that is, once the board determines their risk tolerance for identified risks, how then do they articulate that in a way that operational managers can apply them to the operational activities? So, what would be some of the languages or the approach?
Okay, usually what they would actually give an assignment to a subcommittee that would actually overlook reviewing procedures and guidelines. And in the procedures and guidelines, it will reflect the risk tolerance. So either say we don't tolerate that type of behavior, or we don't do that business with those people, or in this area, or in this industry. So it is actually translated into guidelines and procedures, internal guidelines and procedures, and also reflected in the code of ethics of the various organizations.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark.
My pleasure.
So we are about to hit the end of time. So I wanted just to thank you all for your attendance and your questions today, and I'd like to especially thank Mark for sharing his insights and expertise with us today. For further information or any other questions, please at any point reach out to us. You can reach us by email at info@forestandco.com. Or you can certainly access us via our website at www.forestandco.com. Just as a reminder, a recording of this event will be emailed to you at a later date. And again, I would certainly invite you, if you haven't already registered, to please join us for the next 3 sessions on risk throughout July. And as Mark already mentioned, they'll be on management systems around compliance, anti-bribery, and whistleblower protection. So thank you again very much. Have a pleasant day, and take care, everyone.